history's most infamous anti-Semitic composer, was also one of the world's great operatic visionaries. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner was born in Leipzig, and was even baptized in the Thomaskirche, where J.S. Bach had once been music director. Wagner's father died when Richard was very young, and from a young age he came to believe that his stepfather was his biological father, which may or may not have been true, but we don't know the forensics. He loved theater and opera, something instilled in him by his stepfather, but wasn't really all that keen on piano lessons, even though he was capable of playing things by ear. Music wasn't quite his calling, he thought. He was so impressed and taken with the drama of the theater that he decided that he wanted to be a playwright, and so he wrote a play. And after he wrote said play, he decided that he wanted to set it to music. You know, typical 13-year-old. However, even though Wagner was able to play by ear, he didn't quite understand the theory behind what he was playing, and so he pursued private music lessons while absorbing the music of Ludwig van Beethoven, whose music he came to adore more than anything else. Later on, in order to pay off debts, Wagner even wrote what basically amounts to Beethoven self-insert fanfiction. Yet he wrote a story about himself meeting Beethoven, and it's exactly as weird as you might think it is. Wagner was now dabbling in various works, in attempts to emulate the styles of Beethoven and Mozart, but he wasn't really sure of his artistic vision until he hit upon the idea of fusing drama and music. Of course, this had existed since 1597 and was known as opera, but Wagner had deeper ambitions, and these were ambitions that would shape the course of his music. The 18-year-old Wagner eventually worked his way into publication after being accepted into the University of Leipzig, and his first publications came in the form of a piano sonata and a symphony in C major. And Wagner was so proud of the symphony in C major that he even sent a copy to a composer and conductor he greatly admired, Felix Mendelssohn. Of course, at this point, Mendelssohn wore so many hats that he barely even saw the score, if he saw the score at all, and from Wagner's perspective, he felt a little miffed that Mendelssohn didn't even give him the time of day. The elephant in the room is that Wagner would grow to be an incredible anti-Semite. And not to absolve him of his bigotry, but the culture into which he was born was also fairly overtly anti-Semitic. Throughout Europe, Jews were seen as second-class citizens. The Mendelssohn family, for instance, as rich and powerful and famous as they were even before Felix, were not allowed citizenship, and gaining citizenship was likely why Felix's father converted their immediate family to Lutheranism. After 2 years in Leipzig, Wagner got several successive gigs as choir director and opera conductor, but he liked living the high life and so incurred massive debts in order to sustain a very lavish lifestyle, well beyond his means. Around this time, he married his first wife. And you know when I say first wife, that we're in for a wild, great composers video. Less than a year after their marriage, she left Wagner, only to get back together with him when the couple moved to what is now the capital of Latvia. But they didn't live there for very long either because the creditors followed him there, and so they had to escape under cover of darkness like they were in some action B-movie. Eventually the couple ended up in Paris, where they barely made ends meet. Wagner throughout this time was writing operas, trying to achieve the true and total fusion of music and drama that he had long sought. The first breakthrough came in 1840 with Rienzi, which was championed enough by fellow opera composer Giacomo Meyerbeer that it received performance. This was Wagner's big break, and the money he got from this performance enabled him to move back to Germany, where according to his own autobiographical account, he cried upon seeing the Rhine and swore never to leave the fatherland again. Only he left the fatherland again. After 6 years of moderate success as a court conductor, he participated in the ill-fated Dresden Uprising, the same uprising that the Schumanns had barely escaped by the skin of their teeth. An arrest warrant was issued, and like any good European on the run, Wagner went to Switzerland. This put an immense strain on the already strained couple because, without a source of income and still indebted, they had to rely on the generosity of patrons in order to get by. And this would have worked a lot better if Wagner had not slept with the female patrons and the wives of the male patrons. His wife hated his newest operas, and because of all these extenuating circumstances, Wagner found it nearly impossible to compose, Instead, he just sort of wallowed in misery and just turned his attention towards why he was in such a situation. In 1850, he penned an essay called Jewishness in Music that criticized a perceived Jewish influence not just in music, but in all of art. He attempted to rationalize the involuntary sense of revulsion he had towards the Jewish people, and held them incapable of creating true music because they were incapable of speaking true languages, with the result being an intolerably jumbled blabber. There's one word for that, and that word is yikes. Wagner went so far as to believe that his most vociferous rivals and haters were Jews, and he slandered Jewish composers every chance he could get. When he was just starting his career, he felt foiled at every turn by Jewish composers, such as Mendelssohn and Meyerbeer, who actually helped him. He never would have had a career at all without the help of Meyerbeer. Eduard Hanslick, a preeminent music critic, found Wagner's operas distasteful and sided with the more conservative Brahms in debates over the future of music. Wagner hated Hanslick so much that he wrote a brutal anti-Semitic caricature of him into his opera Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg. He was also more than fine with Jewish conductors and performers who willingly overlooked his bigotry. Those who performed his work he loved. Those who didn't were viewed with wild animosity. Later on, Gustav Mahler, a conductor and composer of Jewish heritage, found great pleasure in conducting Wagnerian operas. And Wagner's musical language found its way into Mahler's symphonic language in terms of orchestrational styles and just length. It was also during his time in Switzerland that Wagner hit upon what would become his defining characteristic as an opera composer, the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk. Conveniently, it also doubles as something you can say after someone sneezes. Gesamtkunstwerk. Well, what is the Gesamtkunstwerk? Well, put simply, it means total work of art, encompassing everything from the music to the lavish staging to really anything. It wasn't just opera, it went beyond that. It was true music drama. It was every art form in one. And in every opera that Wagner was to compose after hitting upon this idea, he goes even further to try to combine all the arts into one single thing. For Wagner, this meant lavish stagings and unbroken dramatic flow, and he moved away from the whole paint-by-numbers approach to writing an opera by its scenes and instead focused on the act as the most basic unit of drama. Bigger was better, and so he employed a massive orchestra, which necessitated top-notch singers. Drama, in Wagner's words, were deeds of music made visible, and so his harmonic and melodic language was all about driving the dramatic arc ever forward. It's important to know that even though Wagner was just straight up a horrible person, he had an incredible impact on not just opera, but in all of music. Musicologists often look to Wagner for the beginnings of modern music, as he was one of the first to bend and outright break the rules of tonal hierarchy. Wagner's music is lengthy and elusive, and it rarely stays in one key for very long at all. His constant chromatic shifts seem to presage atonality that would come in the 20th century. Most famously, this comes in what's called the Tristan Cord. F, B, D sharp, G sharp. Now this sounds like a regular half-diminished chord, but it's not spelled that way, and most importantly, it doesn't act like one. In the rules of tonal hierarchy, dissonances such as these always resolve to consonances. And in the case of the Tristan chord, it doesn't resolve to a consonance. It just goes to another dissonance. And that might seem kind of anticlimactic, but this is huge. Why is this such a mighty breakthrough in tonality, you might ask? Well, if you're going to have a dissonance going to another dissonance, the dissonance it's going to is basically acting in the place of a consonance. You're saying that dissonance can act as consonants, which is a defining characteristic of what Arnold Schoenberg would later call the emancipation of dissonance. The Tristan chord gets its name from Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde, which was composed between 1857 and 1859. Wagner's work on Tristan came in the middle of when he was working on his Ring cycle, a 4-opera, 15-hour drama based on German mythology that in all would take him 26 years to write. Much of the reason that he set aside the Ring cycle for a while to write Tristan was that Tristan was a love story, and he'd fallen head over heels in love with his patron's wife. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and his wife was just sort of used to it by now. Finally, Wagner was able to make a triumphant return from exile back into Germany, when Ludwig II became King of Bavaria at the tender age of 18. As it turned out, Ludwig, while he was still prince, had a massive crush on Wagner's music. And on Wagner himself. He offered to give Wagner a massive estate, absolve his debts, and fund his operatic productions. And Wagner was totally fine by this. Finally able to get his productions done in Germany, with him to oversee the rehearsals and the best musicians available, he soon realized how difficult his music was. Fortunately, he had an ardent champion in conductor Hans von Bulow, a longtime fan of Wagner's work. Von Bulow had married Franz Liszt's daughter Cosima, and while von Bulow was out conducting Wagnerian opera, Cosima became pregnant. You guessed it, by Wagner! Liszt, who was an old friend of Wagner and often paired with him in descriptions of the so-called New German School, was not a fan of these proceedings, which, if you know anything about Liszt at all, is a bit like a pot calling the kettle black. Wagner's wife, from whom he had been separated for some time, died of a heart attack, and afterwards, Wagner sought Cosima's hand in marriage. The problem was that von Bulow just wanted to stick his fingers in his ears and pretend that the affair wasn't happening, and eventually he did grant a divorce, but that was only after Cosima just left him, started living with Wagner, and had multiple kids by him. When von Bulow finally granted the divorce, the couple married. However, this being Wagner, it wasn't the kind of ideal relationship that you'd expect from, well, nearly anyone else. About this more later. He'd long been very self-assured of his own supremacy in the musical art, and now he was objectively one of the top dogs. No one could escape Wagner, whether they followed him, like Anton Bruckner, whom Wagner described as "my man," or rejected him, like Claude Debussy, who was very taken with Wagnerian sonorities, but he used them in an entirely different way. Wagner decided that the best way to cement his legacy was in founding his own opera house and associated music festival in the city of Bayreuth. The plans were so lavish and grandiose that even Ludwig II dropped out, and construction lagged as only a third of the funds necessary came in from a series of what essentially amounted to crowdfunding concerts given across Germany. Ludwig was eventually pestered into consenting to give the rest of the funds, and the festival was slated to begin in 1876. The premiere of the entire ring cycle in Bayreuth was huge for the town. Actually, it was a little too huge. The infrastructure just wasn't there for it, and notable composers showed up only to have a miserable time. Tchaikovsky made it only to realize that hotels were out of rooms and restaurants were running out of food. Franz Liszt was coerced into coming to the first Bayreuth festival held after Wagner's death, and even then, he had such a miserable time that he died, actually. After all this hoopla, Wagner was not keen on running this whole thing again. In fact, despite the funds that they got, they still ended up significantly in the red. However, despite this rocky start, the Bayreuth Festival continues to this day as run by Wagner's descendants, and their productions of the Ring Cycle are a mecca for Wagnerians the world over. Wagner was now quite worn out, and he worked intermittently on Parsifal, which would become his last opera, and which would receive its premiere at the second Bayreuth Festival. Still living large and still sitting on that Bayreuth debt, he needed to make ends meet somehow, and so he decided that he needed to sell some pieces that he wanted to keep unpublished. Wagner's writings at this point became more and more explicitly German nationalist in tone, going as far as, or even farther than, his earlier Jewishness in Music pamphlet. Wagner stated his intention to return to writing purely instrumental music once again, and he announced his intention to write another symphony, but he never got a chance to do so because he died of a heart attack while vacationing in Italy. After Cosima discovered one of his affairs, he was apparently so frightened of her rage that he just sort of flopped over. And while there's no evidence to actually support this, I kind of want to believe it because it's in keeping with their characters. Wagner's music holds together so well over the course of such long time frames due to the use of short musical cells known as leitmotifs. These represented people, items, and places, really anything important to the plot in one of his operas, and they were derived from Erinnerungsmotiven, or remembrance motifs, which could be found cropping up in the operas of Wagner's predecessor Karl Maria von Weber. These leitmotifs allow the drama to occur in the music, with the staging a mere illumination set atop, He could build what he called endless melody within the orchestra, and then, as necessary to drive the plot forward, singers could join with this endless melody and then drop out whenever their lines were over. Now, where does one normally hear leitmotifs? That's right, film scores. I mean, just imagine Star Wars without the music. And specifically, without music that uses a complex web of leitmotifs just like a Wagnerian opera. I mean, heck, John Williams' score is the best thing about the prequels. I'm looking at you, Jar Jar. Wagner also held complete control over his artistic vision by writing his own libretti. Since there wasn't a huge element of on-stage dramatic action, if all the drama's in the music, there's no real reason for all the singers to move around. A lot of opera-goers thought that his music could be kind of boring, because the singers just sort of stood there. Rossini said that Wagner had great moments, but awful quarters of an hour, which really exemplified one of the common criticisms. Other critics simply found the music distasteful because they thought it was a pale imitation of insert critic's favorite composer here. Wagner was so enthralled with getting new sounds out of the orchestra that not only did he require a massive orchestra, bigger than really any other operas for the time, but this also led to the development of particular instruments, most notably an instrument called the Wagner tuba, which isn't really a tuba, it's a crossbreed between a horn and a trombone that sounds like a really fancy euphonium, and is played by the horn players in the orchestra. Wagner also scored for a bass clarinet in A, which doesn't actually exist. Whoops. But to be fair, this was a surprisingly common mistake even amongst later composers, with Arnold Schoenberg and even Maurice Ravel, the consummate orchestrator, making the same mistake. To say that Wagner's bigoted views were a significant deviation from the culture of his era would sadly not be true. But Wagner was such an enormously important part of German culture that by the time of his death, he didn't do any favors in getting this bigotry out of the mainstream. If anything, he made it more mainstream. If Wagner had lived in the interwar years, yes, he probably would have been a Nazi. As it was, Hitler professed a marked admiration for Wagnerian opera. He saw Wagner as a true German, whose philosophy presaged Nazism. After Wagner's death, his descendants, who took over operation of the Bayreuth Festival, were fans of Hitler, and many of them took Wagner's anti-Semitism to even further extremes in their own publications. To this day, Wagner's music is rarely played in the State of Israel, and when it is, it's subject to much public outcry. Musicologists have a hard time oftentimes talking about Wagner because he holds two really distinct places. He's someone whose views were absolutely disgusting in so many ways, but he was also someone who you cannot understand music history without. You can't just be a revisionist and say that we shouldn't study Wagner because he was not a nice person. But at the same time, you can't say that we need to absolve him of the terrible things that he said about people just because of who they were or how they were born, just because he was such a good composer. Art needs to be separate from the artist if we are going to be truthful and honest about characters like Wagner. That's just the long and the short of it. It's possible to toe the line between being honest about who he was and honest about all the profound ways that he affected the course of classical music. You can't look at the 20th century without all these links to Wagner. It's a difficult thing to talk about, yes, but I hope that I've done some justice in this video.